In any event, thank you all again. First, I wanted to thank our sponsor, Sedgwick Brand Protection, who's sponsored all of this year's webinars and has kindly agreed to sponsor next year's webinars. So thank you all very much to them. First, I want to introduce the speakers, and then I want to introduce the subject, and then we'll get started. I'm there in the middle. I am SPSP's webinar coordinator, and I am a lawyer, product safety regulatory lawyer, and I've been working in the product safety field for over 40 years. To my left on this slide, Mark Hickok is Vice President of Product Safety and Regulatory at Milwaukee Tool Company. And Mark has been doing this a mere 32 years. He's a youngster in this product safety biz. To my right, Ken D'Entremont. Ken is has worked at Tridyne Exponent, Tridyne, Exponent, and was the product safety manager at Polaris Industries. And he is currently a professor at the engineering school at the University of Utah. He teaches product safety and has written a book called Engineering Ethics for Design and Design for Product Safety. So he's had a lot of varied experience in the product safety area. Just want to mention two webinars that we're going to do. Well, one webinar, one program. In October, we're just sent out the announcement. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, the top leaders of the Consumer Product Safety Commission have agreed to present to you all on October 21. So look out, put that on your calendar, register, look out for the announcements. They're asking for people to submit questions beforehand that they will try to deal with at the webinar. Next is, it starts this week, well, actually next week, is SPSP's got a program on crisis management's role in professional growth. And, this is meant for, part-time or full-time product safety professionals, and is an excellent program, as all of our programs that are put on by ADK, who do our certification programs too. So these are the topics we're going to cover today. And I want to start and introduce the topic, and then I'll take the attorney-client privilege, which is the first in the list here. And I've been dealing with document issues since the beginning, and I've started in product safety in 1977. And it's a very difficult topic, very complex. We're going to scratch the surface, raise the issues, give you some ideas. We will also provide some material linked in our website with some articles and maybe some other things to give you some more ideas about documentation, proper documentation, improper documentation, adequate, inadequate, and document retention, things like that. So there's a lot of subjects that we won't have time to cover today. But documents are necessary, of course, but we don't know if they're going to be helpful or harmful to the company until they come up in either a CPSC investigation, product liability lawsuit, shareholder questions, reporting to the government for just on securities matters, other kinds of things can be important. So, but we have to make documents just to run our company. And the safety side, we have to create documents that we understand ourselves within the company. And why did our product turn out the way it did? And why do we believe it's reasonably safe and complies with all requirements? So, and what kind of substantiation do we have for the safety processes that we employed during the design, manufacture, and sale of the product? And of course, also after sale, when we start having incidents and near misses or other kinds of problems, what did we know, when did we know it, and what did we do about it are all critically important, whether you have a lawsuit or not. So documents are just run through the entire product safety process, and how you do them can help or hurt the company. So documents are fraught with risk because in a product liability case, if you ever have the opportunity to get involved in one of those, they will try to use your documents against you, of course. They're not going to use it for you. So they're always going to try to find documents that say things and talk about things the company did or didn't do, and to substantiate their argument that you either didn't care about safety or that you didn't do enough to make your product safe and your product should have been made safer. So that's their main focus in trying to find documents to support their position. So how you document the history and what you say are going to be very important, both for documenting the history within the company and for all the other purposes later on. Now, in the documentation area, training employees is very important. You've got to talk to them about what documents are created, how are they created, how are they retained, where are they stored, when are they destroyed if they are. But that also has risk. Some companies have had problems because the training programs made it look like they were encouraging their employees to hide safety problems. One company, an auto manufacturer, got fined $35 million because of one slide in a training program that made it look like they were encouraging the engineers to hide safety problems. So how you train people can also be important. But the important message that we have throughout this whole exercise is, one, you have to raise safety problems, you have to raise safety issues, we have to tell the truth, we have to show what we did when issues were raised, and what didn't we do, and why didn't we do it, and why did we do what we did. So it's a whole process, and it's not perfect. Documenting safety, just in the general sense, has risk. There are some litigators out there who'd prefer companies don't document any safety processes, which is ridiculous in my book. You have to. So the kind of the bottom line is, you want to adequately document things, you want to tell the truth, and you want to be careful how you write them. And we'll be talking about all those things today. Now, involving lawyers in the safety process is important. And as I'll discuss in a moment, it's not because by involving lawyers, we guarantee that all of your safety documents are going to be subject to attorney-client privilege. That's not true. But it's because lawyers can be helpful in asking the right questions, and where appropriate, give legal advice on things you should do or shouldn't do. So lawyers are important, not just after you start having problems, but during the entire safety process. Now, again, I will attach some articles on it, which goes into a lot more detail on some of these things. So I want to now deal with the first topic, attorney-client privilege, in just a few moments, get the boring stuff out of the way. The purpose of attorney-client privilege and also what's called work product privilege, which occurs either in anticipation of litigation or during litigation, they're meant for a specific purpose, and that is to allow the company personnel to communicate to their lawyer, asking questions or asking for advice, giving them information, and that you can feel comfortable with the info that the document you're sending to them is not going to be disclosed either to the government or to a plaintiff in a product liability case. So you're presenting information, generally damaging information usually, to the lawyer. So that document should be able to be privileged. That's the first thing that you have. Secondly, the attorney then is being asked for their legal opinion, and they send you a document giving their legal opinion based on the facts you gave them. That should also be privileged. Other than that, and I'm being very general here, documents are not going to be privileged. And so if you send a document from one engineer to another and you copy the lawyer, that doesn't make it privileged. If the lawyer attends the safety committee meeting and they take the minutes, that doesn't make the meeting and the minutes privileged just because they're involved. If it's an activity in the normal course of business, even though a lawyer is involved, it doesn't make it privileged. And more importantly, the facts that are in these documents are not privileged. So if you're having accidents or you have safety concerns about the current design of your product and you send an email or a memo to the lawyer, or the lawyer sends things to you, those documents are going to be privileged generally, but the facts in them aren't. So if you're deposed in a case and they ask you, were you concerned about the safety of the product, you'd have to answer the question, even though you put that into a document that is privileged. So it's the attorney-client privilege, work product privilege. It involves both pre-sale documentation, certainly post-sale documentation, and post-litigation documentation are particularly critical because there things have happened. But the general rules apply to both. In anticipation of litigation or during litigation, you have the additional privilege called work product privileges, but there are exceptions to these privileges. You copy others in the company who are not involved in making decisions about safety. That could destroy any privilege that you have, even if you have a lawyer involved. The documents given to the government. If you give privileged documents to the government, they're not privileged. You've waived the privilege by doing so. So they could then be discovered in a product liability case. Now, they can be protected. Documents to give to the government can be protected if there's business confidential information. One other thing is there actually is no attorney-client privilege in Europe. So if I have a division in Europe and I'm the in-house lawyer and I send a legal opinion to the engineer in Europe about the safety of their products there, or whether they should report to the EU safety authorities, that document from me to the engineers in Europe would not be considered privileged, even though there is privilege in the US. So kind of the bottom line on attorney-client privilege is it's a very narrow, the privilege is a very narrow exception to just the general discoverability of documentation. If you are concerned about what you are writing or have to write or want to write, and you're concerned about it, and you don't know how to say it, call somebody. The in-house lawyer, your supervisor, the head of engineering, whatever. Talking to people is a good way to let you stop and think about what you're going to say and how you're going to write it. And we'll talk about defensive writing in a minute. So that's one way to do it, because I think generally you should assume that most everything you write is concerning safety is not going to be privileged, could be discovered in a product liability case. And therefore while we want you to raise safety concerns, we want you to talk about these things, we want you to do it carefully and truthfully and accurately and adequately. But if you're concerned about how to do that, talk to somebody before you start sending out emails. Okay, so that's a real quick bit on attorney-client privilege. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark now, and he is going to talk about risk assessment.
Thank you, Ken. So Ken said a few things that are interesting. If you do get into litigation, you're going to ask for documents, and if you have been in there, involved in such things, you know how that works. I do a lot of litigation for this company, and one of the first 2-3 things that someone asks me about is your risk assessment, your safety review. Where is it? What did you do? And so having some type of proper risk assessment with your product really does make a difference. And call it a risk assessment, call it a product safety review, hazard review. There's a lot of terms for it, but at the end of the day, we got to pick something. We've got to own it. We've got to be consistent with how we approach it. And at the end, what I look to most often is it effective? Is it the right thing for the product I'm developing? There are a lot of techniques out there. There are a lot of people doing different things. And one of the things that you got to look at is that the right answer for me? What the automotive people do may not be the same thing as the consumer electronics folks or somebody who makes power tools like we do. And so the elements of what they do may be important. The prospect of what they're trying to do might be the same, but again, how they execute might be different. So we're going to talk a little bit about that real quick. There's a lot of terms out there. There's a lot of standards. There's a lot of options out there. And I suggest a lot of folks get familiar with them. But when I look at risk assessment in general, I really do look at the concept as like, look, I want to reduce risk to its lowest, most tolerable state. What's the best way for me to look at my product and do that? In things like FMEA, all right, failure modes effect analysis. It's great. It has a home for some things, but you're starting with something and you're tracing it down and finding its natural end. If you remember all the things to start with, you will find a great natural end, and there's a great home for that. There are options like fault tree, where you start with an undesired result and you work it backward as how do I achieve that? And then what can I do to kind of play with it? The things like bow tie, where I take, similar to fault tree, I take this undesired event and now I've got a very visual way to look at things. And I can find, here's my threats, here are my consequences. And then I can visually start looking at my design mitigations and place them inside. Again, at the end, each one makes a lot of sense in a certain way. What I found is most often it's not one size fits all. You can't just say this is the only and exclusive way I have to do it. They almost often blend together. So as you look at things like, we use fault tree a lot. And the reason I use fault tree is because I know what I don't want to happen. I can look at my product and I can start with the risk equation and say I want to have my severity and my probability. Well, one of the things in probability is determining the hazard. So if I start with a very strong hazard analysis and you can work that out, I now know what the undesired events are. I can work those through a fault tree to the extent I have data. I can start applying that and develop some probabilities. To the extent I don't, you can still utilize that at some level to develop an understanding of your probabilities. And then from there also, you can start to look at your user base and things, and you can understand risk. By itself, it's a great tool, but sometimes the data that I need comes out of an FMEA. Since we do those for electronics, if I'm looking at an electronics failure, that may be a great source. So again, pure FTA may be one thing I would use, but using that in conjunction with other things makes sense for us. If you're more mechanical, maybe that doesn't make as much sense. But again, keep in mind that you want to make sure you understand what that user experience is. Am I meaningfully looking at that user? Not only what we expect them to do, but what we anticipate them to do. And are we anticipating those things, and are we giving them the best chance to either avoid that undesired event, recognize that event and be able to make a right choice, or we've just taken the option away because our designs are such that we're not doing it. And the best thing we can do is, again, find that proper method for risk assessing so that we can put that right into the front end of a design process. And when you go through and document it, we put it right in, and I know a lot of companies do, but they put it right into their new product development process or their product, whatever you call it. So it's actually part of what you do. It's embedded in your system. So you can develop instructions on how to perform them, templates to the extent they make sense, minutes for these types of reviews, closing issues, making sure you're referencing data, and that data that you're using to make decisions has a home and it can be traced through. So all these things become important, and we're going to talk a little bit about closing loop a little later. But when we get to that, I mean, this risk assessment really is a classic. I'm going to have a whole bunch of loops that I open. I have to start closing them. So when we get to that, we'll talk more about it. But having some rigor behind this risk assessment and putting something behind it that really makes sense for your product seems to really be the starting place that you really want to go. And consulting with somebody, working with, even if you have litigation attorneys, depending on your product, their experience may really be helpful. Experts in the field may be very good to consult with to see what techniques may lend themselves best to you. And also work with a cohort, work with your network to help develop this. And it takes time, but that's okay. Invest the time, because it really is going to end up being worth it. So I think I'll stop there and let Ken, DeAngeman, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. You brought up some great points, and I wanted to expand on one, and that is that, as designers, engineers in safety, we want to do a step one, a risk assessment, then move on. But sometimes, especially if you're working with innovative or new products, there needs to be like a step 0, which is analyzing the use of it. And Marky touched on that. We need to know how the products are being used. So spending a few minutes up front to really have people use it, especially if if there's something different about it, can really make the risk assessment more meaningful and maybe have a few more branches of what you do. And because, you know, I think many of us, if not most of us, are resource limited. We don't have tremendous people power to throw at it. So I'm in favor very much of what I tell myself: keep it simple, stupid. You know, keep it simple to begin with. Don't do what you don't need to, and that's being intelligent with the methods you pursue. But if some of you are new to this, I would encourage you to start off with the fault tree analysis, especially if you have an existing product, because that lets you leverage your knowledge. I mean, if it has blades, you know, laceration is a problem. If it moves, impacts can be, you know, if it generates heat, fires and burns can also be an issue. So the fault tree helps you use the knowledge. You know, I don't want this to happen, I don't want that to happen. If you start off with FMEA, you can get bogged down and maybe get confused, but I would encourage people who haven't done it before to start with a fault tree, an event tree, a bow tie, or a barrier analysis. And the benefit for that, in addition to being simple, is they're intuitive and they're demonstrable. They help demonstrate what you're finding to other people. The FMEA can be a tool, but sometimes it's not the most efficient for safety information. For reliability stuff, it is. But yeah, I would encourage people for the documentation to find the documentation aspect of this question, to find a way to integrate the product development process with hazard recognition, all of this, something like a preliminary hazards analysis. And my book has a product safety matrix that develops a system and helps you work through things. I may talk about that a little more later, but find a way to integrate all of this, both the hazards and risks as well as the findings. And Mark talked about the need to close those loops. So I will pass it over to Ken Ross at this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Yeah, I'm sorry, I moved the slide by mistake there. So we'll get to the next topic in just a second. But I just wanted to say that what you write in a risk assessment is a roadmap for a plaintiff's expert to criticize what you did, because you're identifying risk, identifying probabilities, consequences. They may ask you where you came up with those probabilities. You got to know why where did you come up with the information that goes in there, and why did you decide to not design out the hazard and only warn, or why did you decide to do nothing? So it's a good roadmap to ask you a bunch of questions about what you did and why you did it. You cannot agonize over that. You have to do your best, make the best judgment, record where this information came from, what information you were using to come up with these determinations, and stand behind what you did. And that's about the best you can do. But you need to recognize that in a product liability case, this is one of the documents they will look for, and one of the documents that they will go through in detail and possibly ask you, how'd you do this and why'd you do what you did? So, but that brings up the closing the loop issue. And one other thing I was going to mention, sorry, I will put on the website, there'll be both a documentation article that talks a little bit about risk assessment, but also a risk assessment article that'll talk about how to document your risk assessment, or at least some ideas about how to document risk assessments to minimize the potential for some plaintiff's expert tripping you up during the discovery process. So now I'll turn it back over to Mark to talk about the closing the loop that he mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. So we're going to go to closing the loop. Just touched on, not to go backward, but two things on the risk assessment I thought of as we're finishing up was one, and Ken's exactly right. Like I said, it's one of the biggest closed loop things we're going to have. And if you do it badly, they're going to use that as a roadmap to criticize your work. You do it well, it could possibly be something proactive that you could use in the defense of what you did. So, making sure you get it and doing something well could be as important. One thing I see a lot of folks do is they do a web search, they go find some ISO standard, what have you, and they just take an attempt at something and they've got documents, it looks great. And it's like, you really didn't know what you were doing. You can't defend that decision. Be careful with that. I've seen it happen internally where folks try to do that. Just use some thought, because what that does is that actually opens up a close the loop email. And what is closing the loop or issue? So closing the loop really is like, if I say I'm going to do it, I've got to do it. Okay. I'm going to do a test. I'm going to do something. So I've raised an issue. I've made it public. I've made it part of what we're going to talk about. What have I done about that issue? And when you look at that in the roadmap that Ken was talking about, becomes kind of, all right, you said it, it's a safety issue. I can cut somebody, I can burn them, and run them over, radiate them, chemically attack them, whatever. So now that I know I can do that, what am I doing about it? And if I say I'm going to run a test, an evaluation, perform a calculation, maybe do an FEA on your computer system, then do it. And look at the results and be prepared to take those results and take meaningful action regarding those results. They may not give you the result you want. They may do something, they may suggest that, your initial design isn't really where you want to be. And that's okay. If you look at a design as a practice and engineering as a science, it's an iterative form. You go back and forth. And it should be. We're always learning. We learn something, we take our learning back into the design process, we improve, and we come forward and we do it again. So I think that's okay. But again, you've got to get to that terminal issue where I've made a decision. And I've made a decision and I've used these things and I've done these things because I said I was going to. And here's what I've done. And I've documented that, whether it's the closure of an action item from a meeting, or it's that test I said I was going to do and I've got it in the test report, or I've got it in the project file that I was going to go out and do this analysis or meet with a customer or go do some market research. I've done it. So those are classic close the loop issues. I think we probably get it, but I think the documentation of them, again, is important. One thing that I like to hear about closing the loop is, let's just, again, to Ken's point, is keep it simple, is let's just tell them what we did. Here's what we did. Here's the result of what we did. In some cases, and actually in a lot of cases, especially in engineering, we're not really looking for a conclusion. We're done. When we start editorial and start creating conclusions, we actually start creating data that isn't possibly relevant or helpful. We'll talk about that in some of our documentation stuff in defensive writing. But at the end of the day, what did you do? What happened? It may or may not be acceptable, but that's a decision that'll be made based on the data in the context of what that design is and in the context of what the hazards are and what that user experience will be. And all those things will come together. And again, they're probably feeding back into your risk assessment and saying, is this an acceptable design? Yes or no? Okay, so we've got to have those actions to do that. If you've gotten rid of a feature, you've gotten rid of the issue, you designed it out, perfect. Let's also document that. Take credit for the good thing you did. Put it down. We made it go away. That's a really positive thing. We closed the loop on this electric shock issue. I went with a battery operated product. So now it's a low voltage. That's beautiful. So let's go do that. Some things we may not think about the close the loop are some of these inadvertent openings where you get someone who sends you a note and says, hey, we got this unsafe product that just came through. It's like, do we? We don't know that. So I understand, the zest to do a great job and escalate and tell somebody something. Somebody writes this email and they're trying to push it through and get some action. But what they just said is that our company's position, at least this point, someone in our company says we have an unsafe product, which we don't know. So we're going to have to go look at that and figure out whether that's true or not. So in response to that, we may have to have something to document the closure of how we're going to, close the issue that email raised. And that's going to be something that could be a little tricky. That's something you might even need some help from one of your legal professionals or one of your senior leaders to help make sure you're navigating that in a meaningful way. But we've got to close it. I've had many opportunities early in my career where we weren't very good at that. And you're sitting in deposition and someone drops an email from a product manager. Like, what did they say? They said this was an unsafe product. Like, no, it's not unsafe. Everything we make is safe. Like, well, your guy in charge of this category says that's not the case. And I can't speak for that person, but here we sit with a company record that says we have an unsafe product, yet we're selling thousands of them. Not a great place to be. So we'd like to get out of that and close those loops if we can. The other thing that I like to think about is are we closing them in a meaningful way? So I'm not just going to send an email and say, yeah, that's not unsafe, you're fine. That may be the answer. Most likely it won't be, but something a little bit more aggressive than that. But we've got to make sure that we're meaningfully closing these issues. So if I did a test, I can't just say I did a test and knocked it off the table onto a carpeted floor and it didn't break. So it's mechanically, has good mechanical strength. Well, if I use this product on job sites and I'm outside in concrete or I'm outside at height, that probably needs to be dropped in those conditions so I understand it. So again, find a test, find an evaluation that actually meaningfully closes the issue so that later on in life, when you go and reinvent this conversation, that issue was raised. It looks like you took meaningful action. The actions you took made sense. They resulted in a positive experience and you move forward with a design that makes sense. And that record will tell its story all by itself. You don't have to have that person in the stand talking about it for you. Ken, what do you think about that?
Well, I think you're a hard act to follow, Mark, but I wanted to just reiterate a little bit. But if you're in a meeting and you do identify a problem, keep a list or an action register of what is going on. And at the time in that meeting, if at all possible, solve it or come up with a plan of attack to solve it. And you have everyone's attention. Now's the time to either fix it or find a way to fix it. And don't be afraid to ask for help if you need outside help from some specialist in the company or even someone outside the company. But when all this is done, don't forget, you have to say that you closed it, but you also want results to verify that you've closed it. But again, having a dynamic integrated product development document, such as the product safety matrix or something similar, can really help you bring this together. You can follow things, you can follow action items as they get done. But one thing that is important on these is I found that if you do a test, especially with a prototype or a particular design revision, make sure you document that in your file somewhere. Like we tested it, prototype A1.002, and the next time it was B003 or something. So you can clearly show that this is not the product that we released, and these you can identify what changes had been done, so you can show that you really are doing a good job. And I'll go back to Ken Ross at this point.
Thank you. Yeah, one thing that Mark didn't mention, and that is the safety concerns could be brought up during a safety committee meeting, for example, or just individually between two people. Sometimes it's sort of impossible to close the loop in the sense that the person thinks there's a safety problem, you disagree, and reasonable minds can differ. And so what do you do about that? Well, that's where people who do have safety concerns should, and they're not certain about them, they should be raising those without writing. They should be raising them verbally, either in a safety committee meeting or individually, to see if their concerns are accurate or correct or not. They may be right, in which case, a change can be made. If they're wrong, at least you can give them a chance to retract it. So, but when these are raised, it's sometimes not easy to adequately close the loop if you can't get some consensus among one or more people. And that particularly applies in the safety committee, which I'll talk about at the very end if we have time, where you're recording in the minutes these disagreements and these concerns that are being raised. So think about that one. Okay, well, let's turn over to training. I'll go back to Mark. And as I mentioned, training can be really important because this is the place, one, that can come out in discovery in a product liability case. They may ask you for your training material, the slides, the handouts, things like that. So you don't want any opportunity for some plaintiff to argue that you're trying to hide safety problems, and that's what you were telling your people to do in the training session. So you got to be careful about that. So go ahead, Mark.
All right, thanks. So foundational training. So Kim brought up a good point, right? We've got people in a safety committee. they start having a discussion, a safety issue comes up. One of the things I looked at, and I call it foundational training, is, looking at roles. So what do they need to know? And some of that issue there could have been addressed by not making it an issue in the first place. Can we go through training and have them not write the email? Can we go through and have them not raise the issue inappropriately? But we want them to raise the issue. We want to have that open dialogue. We want to have good, honest discussion about safety, because it's everybody's job. It's part of what we do. It's what we're committed to help our users have the best experience. So training to me is a very important part of what we do. And again, we've got to be careful how we do it. You don't go out and say, oh, never say the word safety. Okay, no, that's not the training. We can say the word safety. In fact, I'm a proponent of saying the word safety when we do it appropriately. I like to show our company's commitment to safety. I like to proactively have documents that show we took this seriously. We invested time, we invested resources, and we put that into a product in a meaningful way. And now we've given that user the benefit of that work. Okay, but we, again, have to do that appropriately. So I like to have some overall training. I think basically everybody, that depending on who you are, but everybody in a new product development process or whatnot should have some level of understanding, not only that we have a commitment to safety, which could start out, like in our case, we actually have a safety policy, and we go through and train people that we have it. Be aware of it, and know that you have a role. And after we get that awareness and we know that everybody's there, then what is the role specific training that we need to do? So engineers might have something they need to understand. Test technicians may have things, marketers, quality engineers, technical writers, everyone's got a role. What is that role, and how can I help them understand not only how they can, positively impact the safety discussion, but also the opportunity to negatively impact that, and how can we avoid some of those negative opportunities? My favorite was a couple of years ago, well, many years ago now, but we had a battery turn on fire in a factory, and it was literally a quality engineer standing next to the barrel who told the person, I will take care of this, don't write anything. And sure enough, a technician walked away, wrote an email with a fire emoji in the corner, top urgent, we got a battery problem. It's like, you don't, because you threw a battery with no housing, no casing into a barrel of metal and you short circuited it. We have a technician problem that should have not been doing what he was doing. And then we escalated that by making a documentation problem because we wrote something inappropriate that should not have been. So there was an opportunity where understanding, even that person understanding their role and what their impact could be would have been helpful. When we, one thing I like to make sure that when I share those, it's not just an awareness thing, but it's like everyone wants to know the so what of the matter. What can I do? So when I go out, and whether you call it defensive writing or communication best practices, what have you, there's a number of phrases you can use. But at the end of the day, how can we help those folks who have to communicate, especially when it's a safety issue, in an appropriate way? So giving them some guidance. Again, understanding their role. One of the things I always love to do is ask people, first off, before you write anything down, ask yourself, should I be writing it down? If I should write it down, read it to yourself and make sure you're doing things. You give them some guidance on what those things are, but go through that checklist. It doesn't take a lot, but mentally be prepared that you've got a process for that. Because when you get to these issues, that little bit of time will save us a bunch on the back end. And it'll probably move us in the right direction. But again, we need to properly communicate. So we're not going to bury communication. We're going to do it well. And when we do that, make sure that you understand that this document probably will have a life. It's coming back. We get into litigation. If we get into a claim, something's wrong, that document may come up. So just write with the position that you want to write a reasonable document that's going to come up 5 years from now. Does it speak for itself? Do we understand your issue? Do we have something that closes the loop? Have we closed it in a meaningful way? And it speaks for itself in a reasonable way. It's to the point, it's succinct, it's accurate, and we can move on. If I need you to come back 5 years from now and explain what you sent in a deposition, that's probably going to be a tough thing to do, because your recollection won't be any better than mine, and we're going to have to figure this out, and that may not be the best action. So again, those are the kind of things that we like to go through from a design process, is making sure that we understand our roles, how we communicate within our role, and make sure that those documents that we put into the project file or whatnot are reasonable. Ken, what do you think?
Well, I think that's really good. Great stuff. Talked about raising safety concerns, and I think a huge part of safety is ethics. I think that's fundamental to product safety in a lot of what we do. As a result of that, I think management has to not only permit and demand ethics from its workers, but it should also reward them. So please do whatever you can to those above and below you on the pecking order to behave ethically. It's the right thing to do, and it also really helps you later on, because there's the term defensive writing, and I understand that, but there is some element of offense in that if you're doing your job right. I mean, we don't hear it much as product safety professionals, but we do a damn hard job. And there are a lot of people who are otherwise successful and go-getters that really don't have the courage, tenacity to really take on these issues. And we take them on as part of our jobs. It's not rewarding, but there's a certain value and merit to it. So we need to be proud of the jobs that we're doing and document accordingly, be proud of what we're doing, and really write down what you're doing. We want to be honest. If you're behaving well, it's the right thing to do. And we shouldn't be on our back foot all the time when we're writing or documenting safety problems. We can write documents, be proud of them, be factual, tell the truth. I don't like really using euphemisms in some of the communications. Some people might use the term thermal event instead of a fire, but that really sounds bad when it's read back in court. It really just doesn't pass the sniff tests, at least with me. But I think it's important to really find out what's going on, documented. And as far as years later, I was deposed on things that happened 15 years ago, 6 months ago. And, records like that will always help you understand the rationale. You won't forget why you chose A over B or B over A, but that will help you. And it won't be sufficient for everyone, but it will at least tell people why you did it. And if you made the right choice, your rationale will help you justify it, and you won't be so afraid of it. But I think, we need to put our best foot forward, which we do, and then document it. So anyway, turn it over to Ken.
Okay, again, some of the written material that will be provided, we'll be talking about some of these things in more detail. Defensive writing is one of them. I have in that article a list of words that I would say raise concerns if you use them. I would never tell anybody they can't say these things, but I do let them know that if you use the word defect in any of your writings, that's a legal term. That's the jury's decision. So if you want to say it, okay, but you may have to take the stand and explain what you meant by it. That usually gives them pause before they try to use words like that. So we're not trying to hide anything. Facts, as from the TV show from long ago, just the facts. So we want the facts. And when we want your opinions, or you have the opinions, you can talk about those, and we know what the basis of the opinions are. And what I say is we're trying to avoid unnecessarily harmful documents. And those are documents that overstate the problem. They're inflammatory language. An example being somebody who sends a memo from themselves to the engineering manager, and the subject line is ticking time bomb. That's not necessary. I can't think of any way that you would ever want to use a term like that. And people do that to get others' attention. Or they're concerned because they've raised a safety issue and it wasn't properly closed, and they're concerned. And so anyway, you've got to deal with the human issues of how to accept people's opinions and deal with them and record it. And I think the juries understand the safety issues are raised, and they want to see that you dealt with them. So anyway, the training is partly where you're going to deal with this and give them some guidance, partly on writing and also when to call instead of write first, and to raise the question about how to deal with some of these issues. Okay, probably the last topic we'll get to before have a few moments for Q&A would be documenting post-sale activities. And this is the real dangerous one, because now we're having problems. We've sold the product, we're having customer complaints, we're having accidents, we're having lawsuits maybe. We have reporting responsibilities to the government possibly. So by definition, we are writing about things that are potentially very harmful to the company. We want to do things and we want to document what we did to show that we are a careful company, an ethical company, cares about safety, deals quickly with problems, gets the information, does things with it. Doesn't mean we have to do anything about some of them. Some of them, there's nothing to do, but at least you can show what you did in analyzing what's going on out there and why you decided to do what you did or decided not to do something. And that's about the best you can do. The plaintiff will always disagree in this area. They'll always say you should have done something different, should have done something more, and that, of course, would have prevented the accident. But you can't live worried about that whole thing. You just do your best and document what you've done. And a lot of problems we've had over the years are companies who do the right thing, but don't document it. Just they're in a rush. They don't have time to do things. And so, 5-10 years later, as Mark and Ken said, you get to recount what you did. Well, you can't remember, or you're not there anymore. You're not at the company and nobody remembers. Nobody has any documentation. And I can tell you, juries don't believe you did what you said in the safety area if you don't have documentation to support it. I think if safety is that important, you should have had some documentation to show what you did. So post-sale area is real important. Mark, tell us what you think.
I do. I think this is one of the things that I struggle with the most. I think on the front end of something, you've got a blank slate. You can do a lot of things, and you get some flexibility. And quite honestly, if you make a mistake, you got a chance to fix it before you put the product out. But once I've sold it and it's in the world and someone's got it in their hands, we're kind of there. Now I start learning I may have made a mistake or I'm not happy with something. Well, one thing I think you got to do is first lure off crisis management. Don't panic. Let's not freak out. It's there. It's real. We're going to have to own it and deal with it. Okay. That's part of the ethics that Ken talked about earlier. Okay. Engineers took ethics training in school. A lot of folks get what ethics are. Okay. Let's own it and let's do things. The other thing is when we don't freak out is let's actually go figure out what's really going on. Okay. Let's not make an assumption. Let's not go react against something we think is happening. Let's try to the extent we can find out what is happening. And then sometimes we don't know and it takes time. So we might have intermediate steps that we'll have to take. Maybe you put some product on hold. Maybe you have to go report to CPSC that says something's going on. Maybe you don't, but you can make those decisions without admitting the problem and then fixing a phantom problem. You can take those steps, be prepared, but then go do the right thing when you investigate. And I think having that investigative team ready to go is really an important thing. You can't wait until the investigation is needed to start pulling people together and saying, hey, I need your help. I like to have those folks kind of on the ready. You got people in quality. Part of the training we talked about is that you may get called into this investigation. The NPD folks know what that means. The technicians, the marketers. So when we come in and have to do one, they get it. But we have those folks ready to go and let's go do a solid investigation and make sure that we're putting together the right information. It was brought up earlier, like sitting in a conference room and something comes up. Don't get sucked into the concept that because you're sitting here right now, you absolutely have to solve it this moment. You may not be able to, and you may try to and make the wrong decision. So do what you can, understand it. You may, again, have those intermediate steps, but start to make sure you're planning for that long-term goal. And long-term could be a couple days, but play for that long play is get the right answer before you start making changes and start trying to, make conclusions, because you need data, you need information, and then you need to properly scope this out to get it. And this is all part of your documentation process, right? We're going to say, what did we do? Here's another great example of closing the loop. We're going to go out and research. Well, then go get it. What did your research teach you? Now that we have it, now we've got some things. What are we going to do with it? Again, these all come back. So the training counts here. Be prepared. The risk assessment may help you say, look, what did I do it? Why did I make the tool this way? What might have happened? Look at that. Look at how you've trained your people, being ready to go and close the loop, and how we communicate these things, and then follow your communication practices all the way through. Again, avoid those conclusions till they're needed, but be accurate, be truthful. And I think that's the big one, is don't bury something. You own it. Someone's got an email in your system, likely is that's not getting thrown away. That email lives. Your company has that statement. Okay. We don't need to proliferate it. We don't need to send it to 25 people and start adding unnecessary, people and creating witnesses here, but you own it. So we're not going to bury that. We're going to have to deal with it. Let's deal with it ethically, responsibly, but professionally. And I think that's the big one, is making sure that you're taking that tactic first. And then all the other things we talked about can kind of fall into play. And there's probably some X's and O's that maybe Ken can help us think about or whatever. But, I think to me, that's the thing, is have the right mindset on post-sale, because it's just as important, if not more important, than what you did on the front end. And a lot of people don't look at it that way. They look at front end being the big one. And it's like, post-sale is a great opportunity to learn and get better. You just hope you're not learning at the expense of somebody who got injured. Ken, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's great. I worked in an environment where a lot of our complaints came through customer service people. So at the moment, if you focus on that, and even if you get them from social media, it's really important that whoever enters it, records it in some sense into a database, which everyone is expected to have and searchable, be very factual, don't speculate. If the end user said it caught on fire, say that the end user said it caught on fire, not that it caught on fire. So it's really important to be clear and factual. It might be true, it might not be, but at this point, this is what we know, and we want to be very accurate about what we're recording, because that will lead us down one direction or another, and putting down the wrong information can really delay the investigation, and perhaps people could be hurt. So people need to be educated, trained, and reminded to be very factual about what they write. And Ken, you mentioned the term defect. It's a legal conclusion. Best not to use it, especially when you don't know what happened. And when customer service people or anyone find a problem or a potential problem, there needs to be an avenue or a path for them to get it the attention that it deserves. So please be sure that your organization has a way to get that going. As far as investigating and analyzing these post-sale issues, it's important that the initial contact, we get as much information, documentation of any kind that we can, whether they're photos, whether they're videos, social media postings, police reports, EMT reports, even news reports. News reports are horrible for accuracy, but it's a piece of information you can either use or not use, and get the retailers, distributors, dealers, and of course the customers involved with that, just to help you get as much information as you can. As time goes on, it becomes harder and harder to get that information. Some of it disappears, some people lose interest, especially those not directly involved. So just jump on it. Make sure you have the support and you can support them, because this is documentation that will be discovered. Even though it may not be a written document, photos, they show up, and involve the appropriate people: engineering, legal, purchasing, suppliers, logistics, because maybe it got damaged in shipment. So be sure to involve those people as soon as they're needed. And if a customer is willing to return a product that's easy to ship, see if you can get it back. Of course, preserve any evidence. Don't do anything destructive without talking to your legal people, but that's documentation as well. And a decade ago, social media searching or data mining was a nice thing, but Now it's expected, if not required, depending on where you live. So, and also, have you learned anything about the use of the product? Was the product being used as intended when something happens? So be sure to pass on these learnings that you might have to the product development team. So for the sake of time, I'm gonna pass it back to Ken.
Thank you. I wanted to say that, I mean, this is an area that's so important. We're going to do a whole webinar on it next year because what I've found is that many companies just have a very inadequate system of training their customer service people, the way the information is recorded from customers, the inability of customer service really to follow up with questions to really be sure we get the accurate information. Most consumers overstate the problem. Dealers overstate the problem if you're getting it from dealers or retailers, because everybody likes to complain, and it may not be true. So, you know, Ken D'Entremont, you said somebody said there's a fire. Was there really a fire? Was there a flame coming out of it? There's a big difference between overheating and a flame. So we really need to help have the engineers help set up the questions that should be asked by customer service and the follow-up questions. Train those people on how to do it. So once we get this information, we know where to follow up, when to get the product back, what to do with it, how to analyze risk. There's a lot of stuff going in there. So it's not just documenting it, it's doing a better job of getting the information and having it analyzed. Yep. So that we'll do a whole program on that because I think most companies could use some help and get some encouragement to do a better job on that, because if we don't have good information, we can't make the right decisions, and that'll be very critical. In this area, a lot of companies try to do a really good job, because in product liability cases, the plaintiff's lawyers are looking for companies that they can portray to the jury as not caring about safety. So not properly recording and following up on post-sale issues when things are really happening. It's not hypothetical. These are real things that are happening, can allow them to do that. So sometimes some companies that I've talked to in the past over the years can justify a fairly rigorous product safety effort merely to minimize the chance that a jury will award punitive damages against them. They understand that accidents will happen. They understand the juries might disagree with what they've done and think they should have done a better job, and may actually hold them liable, for the initial, injuries. But what they want to avoid is any discussion, any testimony portraying them as a careless company, a negligent company, a company that didn't care about safety, because not only can that result in punitive damages, it can also result in shareholder derivative actions, CPSC investigations. So there's a lot of bad consequences when a jury gets mad at a company. So a lot of these documentation procedures are meant to substantiate the care that we exhibited during the design, manufacturing, and sales process and post-sale process, to do the best we can. Again, juries understand, can't prevent every accident, and it's not always the product's fault, but it might sometimes be, but at least you tried your best. And that's what you can do, and that's what your documentation you want to show. I'll just say safety committee, documenting the activities. Of course, you need to document them. And, even if a lawyer is involved in the safety committee, and I've been on a number of committees, doesn't make the committee discussions privileged or the minutes privileged. So, but you need to record those anyway, do them carefully, at least have a lawyer review the minutes to make sure that it's adequate and accurate and correct, and the safety issues that were raised are being dealt with. So sorry, we didn't get to questions. Apologize for that. Let me throw up one more slide here. Sorry. If I can, do that. You can email us with questions, or email individuals, us with questions, and we will respond to those. And we appreciate your attending. Again, thank you to Sedgwick Brand Protection for sponsoring our programs. And we look forward to participating in next month's program, which should be quite interesting, hearing from the CPSC and all their new activities, fun activities they're planning for all of us. So thank you again very much. Thank you for attending today. Have a good day. Bye.